So today's scripture reading is brought to you by the universal warning to be careful what you wish for because you just might sound like an idiot. You've never heard that one, I guess. James and John, the sons of thunder, have proven themselves loud, proud, and clueless. They don't even bother with a question. Teacher, we want you to do something for us, whatever we ask of you. I imagine that Jesus, fully human, as we confess, takes a deep, calming breath before replying, "What do you want?" We want the most important positions when you come into your glory. Another deep, cleansing, grounding breath. Possibly a second. You just don't get it, do you? In fact, this whole theme of missing the point has been pretty consistent throughout Mark's gospel. And not just little innocent misunderstandings. Mark really drives the point home that the disciples are completely out in left field, picking daisies. He cuts them no slack, doesn't go easy on them, doesn't even try to soften the edges so history might remember them more favorably. Frankly, Mark would make a terrible public relations officer. Consider his treatment in recording Peter's public humiliation. "Get behind me, Satan," Jesus shouted out in front of all the other disciples. Holy moly. That is some spicy retaliatory language for just quietly questioning the teacher. And now in chapter 10, it's the sons of Zebedee, the sons of thunder, who come under fire. On their way to Jerusalem, James and John, possibly assuming that Peter has lost his post as teacher's pet, tried their hand at currying favor in the new kingdom Jesus was going to establish. "Hey, teacher, we have a request." Sensing where this was heading, and that being nowhere good, Jesus gives them enough rope, and you can guess what they did with it. "Let us be in your power positions when you come into glory. Let us sit to your left and your right." And in Matthew's gospel, it's their mother who makes this request to Jesus on their behalf. She speaks to him on behalf of her two sons. Now, don't get me started on helicopter parenting. At least in Mark's gospel, they jockey for power themselves, atrociously. It's sort of like, I'm going to do it again to you, so just brace yourselves. It's sort of like that inspirational saying, "Shoot for the moon. Even if you miss, you'll land among the stars." Except it's more like, "Shoot for the moon. Even if you miss, you'll land among the stars, where nobody can hear you scream as you suffocate." They tried. They really did. They tried. They were certain Jesus was going to get into Jerusalem, where he would begin his campaign to topple Rome and establish Israel and the kingdom of God forever. Who wouldn't want to be at that king's right hand or left hand or somewhere powerful like that? The problem was that this king was destined for a cross, and to his right and left would hang criminals crucified with him. "Let us flank you when you come into glory, Jesus." They completely missed the point. They had, one might say, blind ambition. Jesus took the 12 aside again, writes Mark, and began to tell them what would happen to him. This was the third passion prediction, or interpretation of the Messiah's mission, as Reverend Dr. Rolf Jacobson calls it. So 3 times has Jesus explained to the disciples how things were about to play out. "See, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and to the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to Gentiles, and they will mock him and spit upon him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days he will rise again. I mean, he's hardly mincing words. You can't really spell it out any clearer than that, can you? And yet here come James and John with certain appendages of steel, asking for prime real estate in Jesus' forthcoming reign. While Jesus was smacking his forehead, the other 10 disciples are grumbling at the Zebedee brothers for wasting valuable class time to ask for a stupid favor. The whole thing is a farce, not the gospel, but the audacity and folly of the disciples. They just don't get it, even when it's spelled out for them, repeatedly. However, while it would be neat to stay here and give the disciples a hard time, since they have so egregiously and repeatedly messed this up, it's actually a better use of our time to pan out a little bit, to take the 10,000-foot view of what's happening here in Mark's gospel, because he's doing something really neat. Now, like the other gospels, Mark's narrative climaxes with the cross and the resurrection, if you keep reading into chapter 16. But if we're too focused on getting there, we're going to miss this brilliant centerpiece, the pivot around which the revelation of Jesus turns. I invite you to write this down. Hypothetically, if we were to have a quiz, this would definitely be on it. The centerpiece of Mark's gospel is chapter 8, verse 22 to chapter 10, verse 52. This center section is framed. It's bookended by 2 healings of blind men. And these are the only such healings in Mark's gospel. And then within this framework are held 3 explanations of the passion narratives. That is, Jesus' death and resurrection. This shaping of the centerpiece of Mark is not an accident. Mark did this on purpose. I wonder why. In Mark chapter 8, verse 22 to 26, Jesus encounters the first blind man in Bethsaida, just north of the Sea of Galilee. And perhaps the most memorable part of that story is the 2-phase healing of the man. A first touch from Jesus results in blurry vision. The man can see people, but they sort of look like trees walking around. A second application of Jesus' hands yields clearer vision. Somewhere in there, I'm sure, is a sermon illustration of being at the optometrist's. You know, when they flip through the lenses, better 1, better 2. Better 2, better 3. Better 1, better 3. It was the second time for the blind man of Bethsaida. Immediately following the healing, the scene shifts to Caesarea Philippi. We were here 2 weeks ago. And a story of sight is followed by a story of insight. Physical vision followed by spiritual vision. The blind man eventually saw clearly. Well, we thought the same about Peter, too. "Who do you say that I am, Peter?" And Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of God." Great answer. Nailed it. Perfect. Understand, though, Peter, that this Messiah has to suffer and die. And quickly Peter replies, "That's nonsense." Well, this made Jesus see red. "Get behind me, El Shaitan, adversary." Peter's spiritual vision was lacking. And then what follows for the next 2 chapters is an assortment of revelatory events like the Transfiguration and several teaching moments on servanthood, as well as the second foretelling of Jesus' death and resurrection. When they landed in Capernaum for the night, Jesus grilled his disciples on what they had been arguing about while they were on the road that day. He knew, he just wanted them to say it out loud. Mark says the disciples stayed silent. Why? Because they had been bickering about which of them was going to be greatest among them. I'm not kidding. It baffles me how they were not making the connection. They were so tied up in earthly ideas of power and privilege, they just weren't listening. They couldn't see it. So last night, I was breaking up a rare fight between my daughters. Acadia, did you hit your sister? Silence. Acadia, there is a red mark on Piper's chest and she's crying. Did you hit her? I don't want to say. Acadia, okay, fine. I didn't hit her. I punched her. One deep, cleansing, parenting breath. Is it ever okay to injure another person in anger? I kid you not. As I was saying this, she grabbed a couch pillow, went, "Hold on, Mom," and made to thwack Piper in the head. Do you hear the words coming out of my mouth, child? I imagine this is what it was like for Jesus with his disciples. 3 mentions of Jesus' death and resurrection immediately followed, by 3 blundering missteps by the disciples, culminating in 3 repetitious lessons by Jesus. The overall picture is kind of depressing, perhaps depressingly familiar. It does when I think of parenting. The disciples take 2 steps forward and 1 step back, like the discipleship version of a cha-cha. Or perhaps more accurately, the game of chutes and ladders or snakes and ladders, depending what version. You roll the dice, trying desperately to get ahead, hoping for ladders to boost your cause, only to occasionally find yourself sliding back down to a much lower level. A child's game that is also a fitting metaphor for life, and perhaps most acutely for Christian discipleship. There's this moment of revelation and insight, but then it's immediately followed by a tragic slide into darkness and failure. In Mark's centerpiece, it's a struggle for understanding, to see Jesus as he is, and not as we would remake or distort him for our own purposes. Flashes of insight come, but a dark pattern of corrupting self-interest returns. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Blind ambition. If there is a wall nearby, Jesus was banging his head against it. But each time the disciples make a blundering misstep, Jesus takes them back to the drawing board, back to the basics. Peter is rebuked for his self-serving, Machiavellian thinking. The 12 are instructed again in servanthood, and James and John are given a lesson in Jesus' countercultural style of leadership. It culminates in a terse but provocative statement of Jesus' mission. The Messiah has come not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. And then finally, after all of this, we have the closing bracket of the frame, the healing of blind Bartimaeus. We're in Jericho now, much closer to Jerusalem than this section started back in Bethsaida. Bartimaeus was almost passed by because Jesus is exiting Jericho. When Bartimaeus hears that he is near, you see, Jesus' reputation clearly preceded him. He was known as a healer, and Bartimaeus was not going to lose this opportunity to gain his sight. So he spoke up, forcefully, stridently, shouting, probably gesturing. His outburst was sufficiently loud and boisterous that bystanders rebuked him, but he would not be silenced. His behavior stands actually in stark contrast to that of the blind man of Bethsaida back in chapter 8, who was brought to Jesus by others and whose healing was requested by others, and who said not a word until the first phase of the healing had been accomplished. Completely different stories. But in Jericho, Bartimaeus takes matters into his own hands. Using his other senses, he hears that Jesus is passing by, and he responds to Jesus' invitation to come to him. But unlike the healing of the unnamed man in Bethsaida, Bartimaeus' healing is immediate. No two-phase therapy here. No better first, better second. Immediately he received his sight. And also, unlike the earlier healing, this one definitively results in Bartimaeus following Jesus in the way, which is cute until you consider that this is yet another person who doesn't really listen. Since Jesus told him to go, his faith had made him well. He responds by tagging along instead. So what makes the difference then between Mark 8 and Mark 10? Maybe Jesus is just getting better with practice? I don't know. Perhaps Mark is talking about more than one kind of blindness and one kind of sight. The disciples, represented by Peter in chapter 8, had figured out that Jesus was the Messiah, but in their blurry spiritual vision, they still thought the Messiah couldn't possibly suffer and die. And he would certainly want a hierarchy of assistants and would obviously indulge their cravings for prestige and privilege. But they couldn't tell the Messiah from a tree walking. What is clear to us, but wasn't clear to the characters in Mark's gospel, is that the disciples think they know who Jesus is and why he has come. But they really don't get it, not fully. And because of that, they don't know what it means to follow Jesus, not fully. Only with a second touch, with further instruction, and especially with the example of Jesus' own suffering and death, could the disciples gain clear vision and follow Jesus in the way. And to be perfectly honest, they're not going to really understand until after the events of the cross and the empty tomb, and arguably not even entirely then. As the Apostle Paul writes in his letter to the fledgling church in Corinth, we see only in part, as in a mirror, dimly. And I would argue, friends, that we still don't really get it. How often do we feel personally slighted when following Jesus doesn't result in an easier, trouble-free way of life? How often have we fallen into the trap of believing that following Jesus somehow shields us from suffering, hurt, persecution, rejection, or even death? When have we aligned following Jesus with power and privilege and prestige? We still do all of these things today. I once got in trouble with a businessman who, I know that's shocking. I once got in trouble with a businessman who asserted that flashing your I go to church card would get you ahead in the business world. I told him that isn't how being a Jesus follower worked. But definitely the juniors in his companies were learning which keys to turn to manipulate their seniors to move up the corporate ladder. He said he'd fire me. Much truer to the cause is the other man I counseled after he was fired from the corporate world for refusing to go along with the company's unethical practices. He followed Jesus and ended up unemployed. Rarely, folks, rarely does following Jesus result in upward mobility. Rarely does following Jesus result in upward mobility. Jesus, let us sit to your right and to your left when you come into glory. Sorry, fellas, those spots are already reserved for a pair of criminals. Maybe you need to get your eyes checked because you just aren't seeing how this whole thing plays out. But who wants to see that? To see the Son of God bloodied, hanging on a cross? Who wouldn't want to shield their eyes from that grotesque sight? Do you remember what God said at the Transfiguration? He said, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. Listen to what he is saying." He's saying things like, "See, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over. They will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise again." And he said things like, "The Messiah has not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. And he said this too, whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. I guess what Mark is trying to say to us all is that if your ambition is blind, maybe try using your ears. To God be all the glory. Amen.